cameras are rolling.
Rolling. Sound speeding.
The time has come for our celebration of cinema's classic, Real Monsters!
Hello, everyone. I bid you welcome to episode 9 of Real Monsters Podcast. I'm your host, AJ Danna, and I'm grateful you're tuning in. Thanks for joining me today. Previously on Real Monsters Podcast, I spoke with Mark Voger about his nonfiction book, Monster Mash, The Creepy Kooky Monster Craze in America, 1957 to 1972. Today's guest is another original monster kid, and a fellow author alike. Julian David Stone is the mind behind It's Alive, a historical fiction novel taking readers inside the turbulent pre-production process of Universal's Frankenstein. I'll be interviewing Julian in just a few moments. I'd also like to give a shout out to Real Monsters podcast guest Becky Laff on successfully launching Book 1 of her Phantom of the Opera graphic novel adaptation. The book is now in print and safely in my hands, so I can personally tell you it was worth every penny and every minute that Becky and her team poured into the project. Be sure to order your copy before unmasking Book 2. On the topic of books, It's Alive was a thoroughly entertaining read that I recommend to all monster enthusiasts and film historians. Julian David Stone is here to tell us all about the true story. But first, as you may know, I secretly invite each of my Real Monsters podcast guests to begin their interview with their best cheesy mad scientist laugh to keep the fun Halloween and horror vibe alive. So, without further ado, please welcome to Real Monsters podcast, Julian David Stone.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for that mad scientist laugh, Julian. Now, you are somewhat of a mad scientist yourself as the author of the brand new book. It was just published in May of 2022. The book is called It's Alive, and it's about the making of 1931's Frankenstein production. Now, this is a really excellent book that combines a lot of historical fiction with historical fact. And I just wanted to say thank you for such a great tribute to the greatest horror artists of the time.
My pleasure. It was such a joy to write and immerse myself in the world of the beginning of horror.
Absolutely, and you've done it from such a personable perspective that really takes you inside the making of the film and the ins and outs of the movie business at that time, which is actually quite similar to the movie business today. So let's back up just a second and talk a little bit about you for a second. You are no stranger to the entertainment industry, just like the characters in the book.
That is true. I had many years as a screenwriter here in Hollywood, where I still live. I still live in Los Angeles. So that was one of many things that sort of drew me to the story, was my own experiences being a screenwriter working for various studios around town.
I also work in the entertainment industry in LA, and for those listeners who may not know, I've also worked with the Universal Monsters brand a couple of times in what we've been doing at Halloween Horror Nights the past couple years. So as far as Hollywood back in the day, obviously, two of the heaviest hitters of the time were Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. And if anyone's interested to learn the story of exactly how those two men tie in to the making of Frankenstein, this novel contains quite a bit of information about that. Now, Julian, when did you first discover that the story of Frankenstein was almost as interesting as the story of the film itself?
That's a great question. I grew up basically a monster kid, which is the term that's used a lot now for us kids who started in the 60s and the 70s, loving these monsters when they were sort of rediscovered when they were first released on television. And, I enjoyed them as a kid. I built the Aurora model kits. I read Famous Monsters magazine. I was completely in that world. And then as I got older and discovered other things, I kind of drifted away from it. Then about 20 years ago, I rediscovered them as an adult. And I suddenly looked at them and I found all kinds of different things that obviously now being an adult, I didn't see in them originally. So that's when I really got into them and started watching all of them and reading about the history of how they were made. And through all of that, it led me ultimately to this amazing story of what had gone on right before the making of Frankenstein and all the back and forth about who was going to play the lead. And then ultimately it led me to the main character in the story. As you mentioned, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff are among the main characters, but probably what you would call the main character of the story is Carl Laemmle Jr. or Junior Laemmle, who was the 21-year-old who was in charge of Universal Studios at the time these films were made. And that's when I really felt, wow, there's something here that I can turn into an interesting book.
What Junior was seeing in his mind's eye was a future for Universal Pictures that thrived with exciting films and new bold concepts such as Dracula and Frankenstein. And what was living inside Junior's head at this time is actually quite predictive, shall we say, of what ended up being the case for Universal Pictures. Obviously now one of the titans of horror with the classic monster films that followed and events like Halloween Horror Nights now. And seeing all of that the way you've so expertly written it from Junior's perspective at the time of what he believed the story would become and the parallels to a mad scientist was quite an interesting read. Now, Julian, you mentioned being a monster kid. This ties in quite nicely to my last interview on the podcast, which was Mark Voger, who wrote the book Monster Mash, all about the monster craze of the 1960s and 70s. And we spoke a bit on the topic of monster films on television, which makes me wonder, Julian, what was your first monster film you remember seeing?
That's a great question. I don't remember which was the first, but I do remember which one was my favorite when I saw them, which was Creature from the Black Lagoon. Because one of the things, this wonderful cycle of films that started in 1931 with Dracula and then ends in 1955 or 56 with the last Creature from the Black Lagoon films was how fun all of them were. And one thing that always frustrated me is I wanted more of the monsters. And when in Creature from the Black Lagoon, the monster is there at the beginning, the middle, and the end. So that one was my favorite. So that's the one that kind of sticks out to me the most from when I first discovered them. So I can't, unfortunately, tell you which one was the first. I just remember loving all of them. And the Creature from the Black Lagoon was my favorite.
Well, The Creature is an absolute classic and a good choice. You mentioned The Creature also did become a franchise, much as many of these films did. And I've always found it fascinating how, speaking of franchises, Bela Lugosi was so opposed to playing the Frankenstein monster, which you've also detailed in the novel, It's Alive, but later returned to play the role of the monster in a later Universal Monsters film.
I talk about it a lot, why he isn't ultimately in Frankenstein, even though the project was originally announced. And there's actually artwork that exists with him listed as Frankenstein's monster. And there's different stories about why he ultimately didn't do it. And I tell the story the way that based on what I read, in my novel. He ended up, ultimately, he was a Universal, he was an actor looking for work. And one of his greatest roles is in Son of Frankenstein, the third of the Frankenstein movies, where he plays Igor. And from that, they sort of continued, they kept him in the cycle of movies. And like you said, he ultimately ends up playing the monster. And one thing that's really interesting to note, and I don't know if you've covered this before, but it's I always say it's kind of how Bela sort of had the last laugh, because obviously turning down Frankenstein, you can certainly look back and think, now was a mistake. Karloff became a huge star and never stopped being a star. And as we know, his career kind of went up and down. But his portrayal, ironically, of Frankenstein, this is Bela's portrayal, is kind of the one in a weird way that's the most famous. Whenever you see anybody do an imitation of Frankenstein, even to the point that in the original Aurora model kit, it's the arms extended in front of them with the legs sort of stiffly going up and down. Well, that's actually Bela's interpretation of Frankenstein. That's not the way Karloff played him. Karloff had stuff where he definitely sort of went around and was certainly confused, and Karloff is incredible. I actually think Karloff's performance as the monster is one of the greatest in cinema history of any type of acting. But whenever you ask somebody to do the Frankenstein's monster, it's Bela's that they do. So it's always funny to me how, in a weird way, he kind of had the last laugh.
Oh, he absolutely did. And we ironically did just discuss this in the last episode when talking about our favorite Frankenstein monster actors. Mark Voger and I were talking about Glenn Strange and how even to this day at Universal Studios Hollywood, the quote unquote Frankenstein parking structure, it has imagery of Glenn Strange and Bela Lugosi as the Frankenstein monster rather than Karloff. And of course, there can be licensing involved with that, but you're certainly right that he ended up sort of getting the last laugh there. And for anyone interested, there actually is a book by Philip J. Riley, who has, of course, published quite a few rare Universal Monsters books and scripts, of Robert Florey's Frankenstein draft, which is a very important part of the novel It's Alive. So we do have some pieces of facts of the era to figure out exactly how the wheels were turning behind the scenes. But certainly, Julian, you must have more information on that subject than I do. So please tell us a bit about how you started the research process of really trying to take us inside that world of what was happening at that time surrounding the production of Frankenstein.
Research is one of my absolute favorite things to do on any subject. In fact, I always find myself at a certain point going, okay, you got to stop researching. You got to start writing because I just love it so much. And the same thing happened here. And one of the things that I did, and this very specifically deals with Universal Studios, when I decided I was going to, when I discovered Junior and decided, okay, there's a story there, I started reading a lot about Universal. Well, the story was coming together, but it wasn't completely clicking. And the big moment I had was I realized I had to take a step back and I had to really go beyond Universal and I had to look at everything that was going on in the film business at the time. And so I started researching it. But one of my favorite things to research is to read history in the moment, meaning not to rely on other people's books where they just go and tell you what they found, but to actually go and read the trade publications from the period. So, I read the Hollywood Reporter from 1930 and 1931. I read all of the movie fan magazines because it's so fascinating to read history when the conclusion isn't there. You start to read Bela Lugosi starts, obviously before Dracula, he's not mentioned anywhere. Then suddenly he gets mentioned in magazines and you see, there's gossip about him and all this stuff starts to kind of take off. And that's the type of history that I love. And the one thing that was also great about Universal was they had their own in-house magazine called the Universal Weekly, which started publication in about 1912 and came out every week. And it was mostly for distributors and movie houses to know what Universal was doing. And it was chock full of information, with one sad exception. Because the Depression started in around the same time that Frankenstein was made, the publication ceased being made from 1930 to 1932, which is exactly the years when Dracula and Frankenstein were made. So unfortunately, there's none of the week to week information I wish I'd been able to get from that, but it was obviously covered in other sources. Like I said, Universal did put out some artwork that showed Bela Lugosi as Frankenstein, and it was in the trades. In my book, even though it's a novel, there's several quotes from newspapers, particularly at the beginning. All of those are real. And those show how it was covered, that originally it was going to be Bela Lugosi. Then it was, then it wasn't clear if it was going to be Bela. Then it was, both of them. And then finally, as we all know, it's Boris. But the decision was made very close to the beginning of production. And that's what I cover in my novel.
I was also going to remark about the newspaper clippings that appear throughout. I thought that was quite striking as a way to take us directly into the world of Hollywood. And it really was a great way to frame this story as something that may not have had a definitive conclusion yet, the way we know history to have played out in the end. And I also personally enjoyed how you've integrated other movie stars and studios of the day into the picture here in a way that feels organic. Every now and then you'll read a story or watch a film about old Hollywood where the main characters will stumble upon every famous actor that we've come to know in history's name in 5 minutes in Hollywood, because that's how it was. But that's actually not how it plays out in this book. And that's one thing I like about it. You hear about people working in all fields of the industry, and how before he was a star, Boris Karloff was just working day player roles and only doing a few weeks at a time on certain projects. And even when you've written Junior as a character who has not yet accomplished the goals that he's hoping to accomplish within Universal Studios, and you're learning about his journey to rise to the top and become VP of the company, which is on his radar, you've written old Hollywood from a perspective that feels like it is not yet historically significant. It's just a day-to-day business, and I want to commend you for that.
Oh, well, thank you. That's something that, all of the years when I was more active, particularly in the 90s as a screenwriter and visiting studios and working for the studios, you get it right away that it really is a job. It's definitely magical. And to this day, I still get excited, whenever I step on a movie on, the lot of any movie studio. But it's a job. And that's what I wanted to convey. Boris Karloff became an overnight star from this movie. Frankenstein was the 88th movie he was in. Think about that,
Wow.
how much he had done. And the other thing I'd like to say, he was an actor that would get a day here, a day there, maybe a couple of days. Um, you know, that a great way to sort of examine where he was and how much, he was still trying to make it was there's a film that comes out right after he finishes shooting Frankenstein. It was shot before Frankenstein, but it comes out right afterward. And in that movie, his role is literally waiter. His character doesn't even have a name. So that shows you where he was. And he's a guy just trying to get a job. And that's the way it is for a lot of people in the business. And that's what I wanted to portray, that it really is, it's not all glamour. It's a wonderful, great, exciting place to be, but it's a job. And a lot of people struggle at it. And, Boris was one of those people. Bela was a big star after Dracula, but then he went through years that were tough. And Junior may have run a studio, but he had to fight all kinds of battles because it can be it can be a tough job. And what was most important to me about and why I portrayed this moment was all of their lives are completely changed from Frankenstein. Obviously, Boris goes on to become a huge star. Bela, unfortunately, probably the biggest he ever was right before Dracula, because he was kind of the big, they used to call them mystery men, the type of acting. The word horror actually just starts to come into use around the time of Frankenstein. But, Bela was the big one of that for a good chunk of time before Boris obviously becomes a big star. And Junior obviously is proven right by the success of Frankenstein.
This very personal perspective in the novel is so well done. And it makes me wonder if in the process, learning about these men and their journeys at the time, and as a fellow entertainer, if you started to see yourself in their shoes and were able to imagine yourself in these characters' shoes because of what you've been through, would you say that affected the inner dialogue of the characters in your world?
Oh, absolutely. The one who I related to the most was Junior, because we all think we're the young hotshot, and I did actually start my career pretty young, so I absolutely related to him the most. But for some reason in my life, even though I'm a writer, most of my friends are actors, so I spent a lot of time in their world, and I always found it fascinating. So a lot of just the day to day struggle, which I was able to put into Boris, being that he wasn't a star before, really when my novel takes place, came from the experiences a lot from what I saw them go through. And then I've had other friends who sort of became well known, and I put some of that into, the way I wrote Bela. And obviously I did research on them too. One of the nice things is because both of them are sort of well known, there's a lot of great clips of them talking, and there's a lot of information out there biographically about their lives. So I did definitely research that. But in terms of the personal stuff, it all came from people that I knew, that I sort of was able to interpret what had gone on in Boris and Bela and Junior's lives through what I had seen or heard myself.
And there are certainly interesting parallels, how some concepts within the archetypes of Hollywood, whether it be the executives, the junior executives, the actors, the writers, will sort of always be the way it's always been. There's always going to be a structure. There's always going to be a struggle. There's always going to be the concept of an overnight success. And, let's take a moment to talk about Junior in that situation. Junior is someone who is longing for great fame and control. Junior is someone who has a vision, as you mentioned, a young hotshot who sees himself turning around the Universal brand and was successful in doing so. And yet, as a popular culture consuming public, even as a fellow historian, it seems we don't hear a lot about Junior Lemley.
That's absolutely true. In fact, that's kind of become almost a cause of mine because he has been sadly lost to history. My novel takes place in 1931. In 1936, the Lemleys lose the studio, and Junior never makes another film. He lives over 40 more years, and almost all of it in obscurity. And one of the nice things, though, that has come from the book, he has no heirs. He never married. He had no children. But all sorts of people have reached out to me since the book was published who knew him. A lot of family members, cousins and people like that, and other people who just knew him as a friend. And it's been great to sort of fill in the gap of what happened to him. And he seemed to have a wonderful life. He lived here in town. I think there was still money in the family, and he seemed to be famous for having parties, but he never made another film. And he died in 1979. And I always felt that if he had lived just a little bit longer, because that's just about the time that the Monster Kid generation of the 60s and the early 70s start to write books about the Universal monsters. And if he had lived a little bit longer, he would have been interviewed by all sorts of people, because some of the actors, Mae Clark, who was in the original Frankenstein, she lived into the 90s. So she was interviewed quite a bit, and some of the other people who starred in some of the films, they were also interviewed. And I think the same way Junior would have also been, and I think that would have made him more well known to the public. The Lemleys in general, I don't feel have gotten their due. There isn't the same number of books as there are about, say, Thalberg or Zanuck or some of the other early titans of the film industry. So I've always found that to be a shame. And Junior in particular, it was definitely one of the things driving me to write the book, that I find him fascinating and I want him to get his due.
Well, I think that's a very noble way to preserve a lost legacy that has left quite an impact on the industry and, of course, certainly the studio at that time. And that's wonderful to hear that people who are personally affiliated with the real man and the real story have been so complimentary of the work. And I will say it's very well deserved, because this is a seamless book that you can read very quickly, because it feels like you're reading an eyewitness account or a firsthand experience of something that is a very fascinating topic that we just don't talk enough about, which makes me think I'm sure there were plenty of things that could fit the definition of this, given the amount of research that you enjoyed doing before writing this. But was there any particular fact or series of facts that comes to mind when you were researching Junior and Lugosi and Karloff and the whole works? Were there any facts that really stuck out to you as something that you did not know previously that made you say, aha, this is a revelation for how I'm going to bring this all together?
Well, I think the real launching point was the discovery that Junior was 21 years old when he was put in charge of Universal Studios. That was quite a shocking thing to discover. And also the fact that he really was the one that pushed to make these films. I mentioned the Universal Weekly, and that unfortunately it ceased production during, the years that the film was made, but it did start again right after Frankenstein became a hit. And there's a quote in there from Carl Laemmle Sr., where he just says, this was all Junior. He basically confirms that he didn't want to do it. Nobody wanted to do it. And it was all Junior. So that was definitely a powerful thing to sort of discover how much it was him. And something else that I found in my research, one of the great characters, and one of the, frankly, sometimes when you write a book, it's because you wish somebody else had done it and they didn't, so you want to do it, is I love Jack Pierce, the legendary, makeup artist who made the makeup for Frankenstein's monster and so many other ones. So I wanted to be in the makeup room. So I'm like, well, nobody else is doing it. I'm going to write a scene in there. Well, in doing research, I found an interview with Jack Pierce from the early 1960s, that thanks to another monster kid, a very famous one, Bob Burns, this interview exists because he recorded it off of like a local dialing for dollars show in the 1960s with a tape recorder, and that's the only reason it exists. He's interviewed about the original Frankenstein, and he's asked, how did you first find out about it? And he says, oh, Junior gave me the book. So here you have the head of a studio giving the book to the head, the guy who runs the makeup department. I don't think that's happening a lot today in Hollywood, and that shows you the level that Junior was involved in this production and what it meant to him, that he's personally handing the book to the makeup guy saying, we're gonna make this movie. And that, that quote exists, coming out of the voice of Jack Pierce. So, that was another great discovery of just how involved Junior was.
An absolute testament to how these films and any sort of operation at the studio at that point in time was such an interpersonal operation. It was creative ideas being bounced around in a way that agency was very much still a factor in these decisions, as you've outlined so well in the novel. People like Bob Burns have been such a torchbearer for continuing to share the classic monster stories that were told in the actual era in which the films were new and in the monster kid craze thereafter. And it must be surreal for you as a monster kid yourself to now see yourself among the ranks of these historians such as Bob Burns and telling stories. How does it feel to be contributing this information, not only about Lugosi and Karloff, but also, of course, Junior, to the grand canon of classic monster lore?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I am certainly honored to be mentioned in the same sentence as Bob Burns and any of the other people that have been doing this a lot longer than me. So I'm honored that you did that. And certainly anytime I get mentioned with their names, it's a thrill. And yeah, it's really fun. I mean, I've been absolutely thrilled by how well the book has been received. That's certainly been, that and having the relatives of Junior reach out to me have been the best part. And I also got a letter from Sarah Karloff, Boris's daughter. That is something that I will cherish for my entire life. She was very, very kind and really liked the book, and she even gave me a quote I could use for promotion. So that's been an absolute thrill. And these people are all heroes to me, and I wanted to honor them, and I'm glad that that's how it's being received. They were human beings. They, like anybody, they had good and bad, but they're all heroes to me, and that seems to be the way the portrayal is being received, and that makes me very happy.
I'm very glad to hear that, and especially the blessing of Sarah Karloff. That is definitely high praise from someone who has also worked quite hard to preserve the legacy of her father and making sure that the artistry behind the films is something that we never forget and will still continue to cherish, because though at the time they may have just been jobs, these are films that have gone on to influence the way everyone after has done their jobs, and the way that Junior made his decisions at the studio have gone on to determine the films we're making now. I mean, we might not even have events like Halloween Horror Nights at Universal had it not been for Universal Pictures creating films like Dracula and Frankenstein, which brings me to the more whimsical portion of our show. We've spoken about the wonderful details of the making of It's Alive. Now let's place you back in the mad scientist role for a moment and ponder for a minute that if you were a monster kid again, using your talents as a screenwriter and your experience and research from writing this book, if you were in Junior's shoes, if you had no budget constraints, what classic monster film or crossover or product would you have put forth at the studio at that time?
Boy, well, I'll tell you the some of the stuff that I'll tell you a couple of things. One, the Invisible Man, which is another one of my favorite of the, I sort of look at the originals that were made while Junior ran the studio as the bedrock that established the cycle. And originally, an Invisible Man is one of them. Originally, the Invisible Man was supposed to star Boris Karloff. So that's something I'm very interested in knowing if that, what that would have been like. And then the other thing, which actually, when I initially decided I wanted to write a story around the Universal monsters, was my original kind of idea but it ultimately, when I tell you what it is, you'll see why I couldn't do it. Is it would have been great to have a film that starred Lon Chaney Jr., Boris Karloff, and Bela Lugosi, which I believe is what Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was supposed to be. And it turned out, Boris didn't want to do it. So that would have been something I would have loved to have seen come to fruition. That's something that would have been amazing, and literally was my original idea, because I thought, God, isn't it interesting that you have these three great actors that played this role of Frankenstein's monster, and I wanted to tell, like, oh, look at the different way they did it, and then it would be great if they actually interacted with each other on some production. Unfortunately, they never did. The good news is that kept me going, and I found Junior, and that's where I landed. But that would have been my dream, to have put together a film with the three of them in it together.
That's something that I also personally can agree with, because Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is actually my favorite Universal Monsters film. And even though I do have a soft spot in my heart for Glenn Strange, having his been probably my favorite makeup look for the character, you're right that it would have been something else to have Karloff alongside everyone else in that film to really round out the trio and sort of have the quintessential piece where you could say, these were the icons of horror. And had this all been 70, 80, 90 years later, we would have gotten to the multiverse era. We can have 3 Spider-Men on screen as the same character, so why not 3 Frankenstein monsters?
Yeah, absolutely. In a weird way, kind of what Universal did with the cycle of movies kind of foreshadows the multiverse, because you start with, like I said, the originals with that Junior made, then you have the sequels, then they have the mashups. They put all the characters together, in House of Frankenstein, and all of that, and Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. Then you have the comedies with Abbott and Costello, and then just when you think it's done, you have a little mini cycle with The Creature from the Black Lagoon, where you have the original, the sequel, and then some might argue the last one is a comedy, not intentionally. And then it's all over. So that kind of foreshadows the way Marvel has sort of found, like, well, we're kind of out of stories, oh, we'll put them all in together. It kind of does shadow it. And as you must be well aware, they did want to, their whole dark universe thing, which unfortunately hasn't found a way to work yet, was kind of their idea to kind of launch it, and it hasn't quite worked yet.
Yes, even without the interconnectivity that the Dark Universe was planning, I think we're at an interesting crossroads where films like Lee Whannell's Invisible Man are doing such a great job of reinventing these stories in a way that doesn't feel forced and is bringing something completely different to the table. Obviously, we've had reboots of Dracula and Frankenstein many, many times in society, but it would be interesting to see how these characters, as they originally intended in these crossovers, could be brought to the screen. And I'm very fortunate as an actor to have been involved in quite a few of the crossovers that Halloween Horror Nights has done. And although they were not, of course, played by their original iconic performers, as we just mentioned, we can't have the trio nowadays, it is still very cool to see these characters integrated into stories the way they used to be in the old days.
It's so wonderful how vital these characters are still today, which is incredible for characters that go back, almost 100 years. It's really just wonderful. And that the look that is the most famous for all of these characters is really the look that was established in the 30s. So it just really is a testament to the staying power, and something that I, for some reason, never really figured out until recently. But I believe the phrase "it's alive" from Frankenstein is probably the oldest quote from a movie that you can say to virtually everybody, even people that haven't seen the movie, and they'll know what it's from. You say "it's alive" and they know it's from the creation of Frankenstein, even if they've never seen the movie. It's just that famous, and I believe it's the oldest quote from dialogue quote from a movie that you can get that reaction from.
And therefore you've chosen the perfect title for the book. The moment I saw the title, I said, aha, we're in for something related to Frankenstein. And what unfolded from there was so much more. Of course, I would still be interested in reading any material on Frankenstein and Dracula. That's why I have this podcast. But once I discovered the story of Junior and the way that all of these iconic characters were involved in the Hollywood of the era, it was such an entertaining read, and something that has got me looking forward to your next piece. So if you're able to share any details, what's next for you in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm about halfway through another novel that is going to be about another obsession of mine, or take place within the world of another obsession of mine, which is the space race of the 1960s, the Apollo
Mm.
era. So that's the one that I'm working on now.
Well, I look forward to reading another slice of an interesting era of history through the eyes of the characters, the way you have so expertly done in your novel, It's Alive. Now, for anyone out there who is looking to read the novel, It's Alive, and follow along with your future projects, where can they get the book and where can they stay in touch with you?
You can find out more about me and my other projects at juliandavidstone.com. I sell autographed copies of the book through the website, or you can get the book at Amazon or anywhere else that books are sold.
Thank you so much, Julian, for your time, and thank you very much for your efforts in keeping the classic monster and film history alive.
Doing that has been my pleasure, and it's been my pleasure chatting with you all about the wonderful world of Universal Monsters.
And with that, keep it real, monster fans. I'm AJ Danna, and I'll catch you next time on the next episode of Real Monsters Podcast. Real Monsters Podcast theme song by Alexander Taylor. Real Monsters logo and key art by Will Davenport. Real Monsters Podcast is an unofficial fan tribute to the classic monster stories of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and is not sponsored by any of the entertainment entities discussed. Any and all opinions expressed within Real Monsters Podcast are those of my own or those of my guests. Stay tuned and subscribe to Real Monsters Podcast for even more monstrous discussions.